welcome and to Fraudible, the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners and to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're discussing wildlife crime, and I'm delighted to be joined by practitioner Lionel Hachemin and practitioner academic Lauren Young. And thank you guys for joining me. Lauren, I wonder if you'd mind giving us a brief introduction into you and your work, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. Hello to the audience, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me on the podcast. My name's Lauren Young. I am a researcher and academic working on environmental crime. So that involves everything sort of from illegal wildlife trade, so trade of wild species, down to illegal fishing, but also into things like sort of unsustainable uses of natural resources generally. So it could be sort of timber. I've done a little bit on critical minerals as well in the past, but my kind of specialism is in the sort of terrestrial space of wildlife. So.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Lionel, and the same, and to you, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, and hello everyone that is listening. I'm Lionel Hachemin. I'm working for an organization called IFO, and I'm in charge of, or at least a program manager for our work to tackle wildlife crime, and I'm even specialized, but not exclusively, to what we call wildlife cybercrime. So it's everything that touched the internet at any stage of illegal wildlife trafficking or wildlife trade or illegal wildlife. I mean, all of those terminologies that are under this big umbrella of wildlife crime. So, yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you to maybe narrow down that umbrella a bit. So can you tell me, in a simple term, if possible, what is wildlife crime in a nutshell, and why should people care about it?
I can start, and then I will let Lauren complement. I think a way to see wildlife crime is all illegal activities that involve wildlife, and in that case, to be illegal, most of the species will be protected. So it goes around all of the supply chain of that you can imagine, from the poaching of animals, so that's the sourcing basically, until the consumption of illegal products of or live animals, and it goes through all the different chains. So we talked about poaching, but also the smuggling, contrabands. It also touched corruptions, it touched money laundering, and at the end of the chain, the consumption or the possession of protected species.
Just to jump in and add to that, I think Lionel summed it up really well there, but just to also mention that we're not talking always just like live wildlife. So it can be all manner of different commodities that are coming from wildlife. So that includes, we call them derivatives. So it can be things that, like, for example, elephants are traded as ivory, but that ivory is sometimes broken down into sort of powder form, for example. And that can be also traded and is highly profitable.
And one important element of wildlife crime is that it's mostly led by organized crime. So we're talking about mostly transnational organized crime, because it's an issue that touches all areas around the globe. In most of the case, those same organizations are also linked with other form of organized crime. So you can think of drugs, weapons, human trafficking, counterfeits. And that's one of the largest form of transnational organized crime, for not so simple but still simple reason that it is an area with a lot of profits that can be generated, but very low risk of deterrence compared to drug trafficking.
I think just to add to that, there's huge profits involved in it. So I think we sort of term it as like it's a high reward, sort of low risk endeavor for organized criminals. So hence big involvement there. I mean, I'm trying to sort of pluck some of the figures to just kind of illustrate it for the audience. But I think they estimated like illegal wildlife trade is worth something like 15 billion annually, and I think at one point it was like the third most profitable kind of illegal trade behind, I think, drugs and arms. Mine was that marry with what you know?
Yeah, that's more or less the figures I have. Everything is extrapolated because by essence it's we don't know what is happening, but then when you combine wildlife, so terrestrial wildlife, fisheries, even timber, the estimation goes to 100 billion of profit generated per year. So we're talking about millions, if not tens of millions of species or derivatives that are being trafficked every year. So we're on very large scales. And compared to some of the media narrative, it's not, but so to rephrase it, it touches every region of the world. So we all hear about the ivory, or you may have heard of the ivory being taken from Africa to be sold in China and Vietnam. But the reality is it's much more complex. It's almost an ecosystem that is alive, very dynamic, very fluid, with a demand that depends on each region of the world. The UK is one also a big market in terms of demand, but every region of the world is touched, and with different species every time. And we're also talking about a large variety of species that are being involved, also tens of thousands, and also the complexity to deal with it.
Just while we're on the species as well, I think it's important to just note for the audience that obviously some wildlife trade is legal. So it is, there are regulations out there, and species is traded perfectly legally internationally, every day all around the world. But there is that sort of framework, that regulation around the trade of wildlife. It only regulates sort of certain species. So there's a huge amount of wildlife trade that is also unregulated. So that falls into that category of sort of there's illegal, but there's also a lot of unsustainable use of other wildlife as well.
Yeah, and the legal market also is very interesting because it also provides opportunity to launder illegal activities under those legal markets. To give an example, maybe for the audience, some of the species that are legally traded might be species that have been captive bred for a certain number of generations, for example, reptiles in Germany, that then can enter the legal market. But a way to launder those species is to poach or to catch a species in the source country. So, for example, we can take parrots in Gabon, for example, to import it in the EU and to launder it as being captive bred. And because the traceability is very hard, suddenly it enters the legal markets, then can be sold as legal. So the traceability is also a very important component that is hard to follow.
And just in that wildlife laundering, that sort of involves a huge number of different actors, criminal actors that are sort of involved around that. So you've got the actual, kind of poachers who are taking the wildlife from the wild, but also those individuals who are working at the captive breeding centres. You've even got instances where sort of veterinarians will need to be involved as well to sort of provide, some of the species require sort of microchips for the permitting and things for this trade to occur. So there'll be a level of corruption around sort of lots of different individuals along the supply chain as well. That wildlife laundering for me is like one of the most sort of interesting aspects, I think, of wildlife trade, because sort of once that illegal wildlife is in the legal system, it's very, very difficult to trace back and sort of it ostensibly becomes legal.
So what sort of species then are the most used in terms of wildlife crime? Because off the top of my head, I would think elephants and other animals that may be close to extinction. But are there ones that we maybe wouldn't necessarily think of as being part of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones I suppose it thinks it's sort of how you would classify it in terms of whether you're talking about the volume of the species that's traded or whether you're talking about the value of it. So in terms of illegal trade, obviously there are some species that are higher value in terms of them as a commodity, an illegal commodity, but in terms of the volume, I mean, things like sort of reptiles are traded in huge numbers all around the world from lots of different source countries. Lots of fisheries products as well is a big one. Sort of shark species, and also with fisheries products, it's quite difficult once they've been caught. And like with shark, for example, shark meat, sold as meat. It's very difficult to sort of establish exactly which species it was when it was taken from the wild. So it's the identification can be quite difficult. But all manner of species. I don't know, Lionel, if you want to add any more.
Yeah, that's one of the specificities of wildlife crime, specifically the parts around what we call exotic pets, so wild animals that are then being possessed to become so-called pets. Is there is this urge to get the rarest specimens and animals. And so you also have this phenomenon where the species is barely known by academia, that they're already being trafficked and illegally sold. So you also have this urge to get the more colorful parrots or the reptiles that is the weirdest or anything pretty much. And that's also why this wide variety of species is a big problem, because you also need to identify for law enforcement. For example, you need to be able to identify what species it is and whether it's protected. If so, under which regulation, what are the requirements. So pretty much everything that you think can be possessed can be traded. We're also talking about butterflies. We're also talking about meat. That can be everything pretty much.
I think just to emphasize as well that plant species is a big one, and that's quite a big concern. I mean, one of the ones sort of recently that kind of jumped out at me was we all kind of the craze for sort of houseplants and things. It became a big popular thing to have houseplants and succulents in all around the world. And as a result, there was this sort of drive to have the most, interesting and rarest sort of succulent species, cacti species and things. And therefore, there were actually, organized criminal groups that were dealing in, taking all the specimens of these, succulents from the wild and shipping them around the world, and therefore making the sort of local populations completely extinct. So, it can be any manner of species, weird and wonderful.
And so we just touched on a concept, and that is seeking the rarest or the coolest, or I want this species, which is the demands. We're really in a paradigm of supply and demand. With one component is with wildlife, you also have the component of speculation, where by making a species rare, you also can increase the price. So you also have this potential dynamics where if you reduce the number of wild species, that increase the number of the value of the product you have. So you also have this dynamics of a potential speculation, but it's all about demands. And also this has really increased with obviously the arrival of the internet and the surge of social media, because today we can get pretty much anything from the internet. We can connect with people, for example, in Mexico, to get us this reptile. We just send the money and the thing arrives through the postal courier. And so everything is so demultiplied and so globalized with the internet and social media particularly, that also help to normalize species that we can see online, and so we consider being normal. We can think of, I think most of us have seen video of African grey parrots online. They're really cool, they can talk, but not many people know that behind this video, most of them have been trafficked from their source countries, our source range, and today more than 95% of the wild population is dead. And so that's all of these mechanism of that the internet has allows that also contributes to making this one of them has a problem as it is right now.
So how do you then go about investigating these crimes? Is it off the back of people tipping off, or people submitting reports, or do you have people on the ground who sort of know where the hotspots are for this sort of thing? How does it look in practice?
I mean, it sort of varies a little bit, I think, by species, depending on what you're talking about. Things that are sort of more bigger sort of mammal species, for example, the more charismatic species like elephants, obviously there's an obvious kind of, when they're poached, there's an obvious sort of carcass that's left, and you know, a majority of it is for the ivory, as opposed to sort of human wildlife conflict and things. Other instances will be, in terms of people tipping off in sort of captive breeding facilities. We did some sort of in the past been involved in some investigations that have spoken to informants around captive breeding facilities, and then they sort of give us information around the fact that it's the species are actually being taken from the wild and laundered through those facilities. But then some of it, I mean, you can kind of quite easily identify it, and that's if you're looking online, for example, you can find species for sale which cannot be sold without appropriate sort of permitting, or shouldn't be sold at all in some cases. So it is in some cases done quite openly, and I think it just goes back to, I think Lionel touched on it, that it is sort of quite a low risk crime at the moment. It's not in most countries around the world. I mean, some are dealing with it better than others, but it isn't sort of a high priority crime for law enforcement agents. So, the organised crime can sort of often get away with it. You put it out in the open. Yeah,
and just as a reminder or disclaimer, both Lauren and I, we don't really investigate. We support law enforcement investigative efforts. This is not our mandate to investigate. We're simply charity practitioner academia. But to come back to the investigation, where we work with law enforcers, we work with customs, we will work with the private sector, with pretty much all stakeholders. You need to investigate through the whole supply chain. So that means in source countries, in transit countries, in consumer markets. And that means you need to combine both online investigation, financial investigation, but also investigation on the ground with some enforcement network. Whistleblower is a big, also obviously big support, and that's a very important system. In some countries, you can get rewarded for that. But not everywhere. But that also comes back to being able to do it in a way where all of the evidence can be used in court. So we come back to also the problem of corruption, but also the problem of mismanagement of evidence, but also to be done in a safe manner for the people, particularly the people on the ground. So that could be our colleagues, but also rangers, law enforcement, intelligence officers that are working on the ground, where they live around those people. We are a bit in a safe space here, if we can say so. So that's also thanks to all of those on the ground. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do that. And then to finish on that, there is also all of those international body and NGOs can play this role, to play the role of conveners, to be able to put two regions or two countries together around the same table to share information. If we have a case between the UK and Yemen, to be able to have the authorities of both countries to talk and to work together on a case. So it's all of those elements, basically working with everyone. And I think, you touched on it there, Lionel, as well, around just the financial crime element of it as well, which I think is quite an important thing to delve into. I mean, we mentioned that it's quite often, with most of these species, it's quite high profits involved. So that sort of identification of the financial crime that goes alongside the wildlife crime is sort of a really important technique as well. And there is, I mean, it's still probably in quite sort of early stages, but there is a lot of move at the moment towards following the money around wildlife crime. So working with financial institutions, because I mean, some of these profits and money, I mean, they're going, obviously into these organised crime groups, but the money is being sent sort of all around the world and through normal kind of banking systems. So it is possible to trace some of this crime and the individuals involved through those transactions. And
I mean, some of that again is done fairly, quite openly. It'll be there in the description of the payment transaction exactly what it's for, despite it being illegal. Other times they will use, sort of code names for species products and things. But I mean, it is there, and so financial institutions can report any suspicious transaction to law enforcement agencies around wildlife for them to pick up. It's done with varying degrees of success around the world, but there is a push for it to be used more thoroughly now as well.
And you may wonder why it's quite late compared to other crime, because from my understanding, we're very far behind to the current practices when we touch on terrorism, drug trafficking, etc. And that comes back to one of the challenges we have in this space, is that in most regions of the world, wildlife crime is not considered as a serious crime, which leads to less adequate legislations, also less resources to law enforcement to do their jobs and to face the problem. And so we are quite late compared to other organized crime, despite the size of it and the profit generated from it. So one of the main tipping point would be that wildlife crime become a serious crime that would increase all the resources and tools available for law enforcement, also increase the sanctions, and now we can start rebalancing the ratio between profit and risk.
I think around that, it's also just important to note that I think in some of the countries' jurisdictions that are sort of starting to take it a little bit more seriously, unfortunately, it tends to be that it's sort of the low level poachers that are being kind of targeted by law enforcement, whereas there isn't yet. I mean, there's more sort of encouragement from the international communities to do it, but to actually tackle the organised crime elements of it is a little bit more difficult. But there is, move towards it, so hopefully that will improve in the near future.
Can you both give some examples of some of your favourite or most interesting cases that you've worked on in the past? Obviously not open and investigations, but if there are ones that you can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of what we weren't obviously investigating it with law enforcement directly, but it was just something that we researched around. So, just speaking to sort of different stakeholders along the supply chain. But for me, one of the most interesting ones is the trade of turtles in Peru. So they have ranching facilities in Peru, which essentially, a ranching facility differs slightly from a captive breeding facility in the sense that a ranching facility is allowed to take a certain number of turtle eggs from the wild, with the idea that they hatch those turtle eggs under artificial conditions, and then they release a certain proportion back into the wild, and then they're allowed to trade a certain proportion on the international market. Where this comes into problem with some of the ranching facilities in Peru is that they are often either not releasing the proportion back into the wild that they should be, or they're releasing that proportion back into the wild, but then tipping off sort of local poachers who are then sort of recapturing these turtles and then trading them again. So it's not sort of safeguarding the species in the ways that it should. And those turtles obviously traded in huge numbers on the international market. There's a big demand for them, particularly in Asia, both as pets but also as food as well. So it's for me that's quite an interesting one, and it really sort of came to life. I was actually working with a conservation project in Peru, Esperanza Verde, who are a great little project in the Peruvian Amazon, and we had about 6,000 baby turtles turn up one day, which had been confiscated from the illegal wildlife trade. So they had been taken from the wild illegally, and were being illegally traded. But what do you do with 6,000 turtles? So it was a very interesting day for the volunteer group.
Fair enough. Lionel?
Just to bounce back on the last point of Lauren, this is also another specificity of wildlife crime, which is the case for other organized crime, but not all, is the work doesn't stop at the seizures of, especially for live animals. You need to deal with the animals after, and that's a subject that is not enough taken into consideration. You have the risk of invasive species, you have the risk of public health, also some institutions, they have to euthanize the animals because they can't release them into the wild, or sometimes some animals are not releasable, so they end up in sanctuary and you need funding for that. And so my story is also around that. It's not around Peru, turtle, so at least we'll have another species. We were doing some online monitoring like we do usually, and we encounter someone selling a baby orangutan, was selling that internationally. So we put together a small team, but composed of people from Indonesia, because the seller was from Indonesia. My colleagues from the Wildlife Trust of India, they were the ones doing the online monitoring, and very quickly we started looking into this case, building kind of a package that we could share with law enforcement. And long story short, a few months after, but actually took a number of operations, we've been able to get to the broker, to then get to the two different level of poacher, because it's really, at least in that case, you have a certain degree of organization or structure within the network. And we ended up seizing gibbons, leaf monkey, pangolin, a few wild cats, but also some derivatives products, so like some penguin scales, some hornbills. And so this case that was focusing on the baby orangutan that was later called Logos by the Indonesian authorities. I ended up leading to multiple operations to dismantling, or at least disrupting, an organized network by convicting 4 individuals. So they've been arrested, then you had the prosecution and the conviction, and also having the baby orangutan saved, and he was still alive and okay. And so the work continued after that, after guaranteeing the conviction, but also to get the little guy. He was 8 months old at the time, and probably the poacher had killed the mom, probably sold the school. And so on the video, we could see that he was just alone. And it's quite sad actually to see. But so we have been able to rescue the baby, have a vet that would like take care of him for the first few days. And a month later, we've been able to relocate him to where he comes from. So he was coming from Borneo. And now he's in a forest schools, like they call, so rehabilitation center with other orangutan. And it would take 3 to 5 years to come back to the wild. So that's the whole process of, it doesn't stop at the convictions. And obviously you need to support prosecutor, judges, but the animals also, if you want to put it back to the wild, it will take time. And so for an orangutan, that's between 3 to 5 years. And the focus was also to make sure we were looking more at a systemic approach, like Lauren mentioned, and not just at the poacher level, but really so that we disrupt the network rather than just harassing the poacher. They can get a new one, and there is a high risk that the poor Logos might be captured again later in his life. So that was also a good example of what we see online is not just a virtual pictures. There is a live animals that is behind us. And just liking, sharing is also being active in that, in increasing the visibility of the adverts, making the algorithm understand that this is something that is desirable. And so that was really good to see the whole, from the picture and video on Facebook to now the video rehabilitation center. But that's the work of people in multiple parts of the world on WhatsApp. I can trust on that. And just also the need to bring a bit of money to support law enforcement on the ground and investigators on the ground, because without that they wouldn't be able to do it. And we're talking of a situation where there are still a number of law enforcement agencies that don't have laptops for everyone, or work for everyone to investigate online. Don't even have salary for some of them, so sometimes we also support salaries to provide them with kind of more sustainable livelihoods. But so Logos is doing okay, and all of the other animals have been released.
So also, just to pick up on that point, Lionel, that I think that's also a great example of just how these criminals are not particularly, they're not just dealing in one species or product, so they'll be quite opportunistic about it in terms of wildlife trade. It will be they'll have all manner of different species that they'll be trying to illegally trade. But sometimes, I think Lionel mentioned it briefly already as well, but it also interacts with other commodities as well. You get quite close to these organised crime groups with narcotics, for example, and other illegal gold mining as well is another big one in the Amazon. So yeah, it very much interlinks with all the similar sort of criminals. And like Lionel also touched on there as well about sort of the importance of kind of working with the judiciary and the kind of prosecutions sort of side. I mean, that's something that there's sort of increasing emphasis on the need to kind of work with the judiciary, just in the sense that sort of raising that awareness around the kind of severity of the impact of wildlife trade, wildlife crime in general, what the actual impact is on the ground, because I think there is a sense sort of, and this is across the board, across countries, that the judiciary aren't kind of aware of those impacts, and therefore the sentences that are kind of given to criminals who are involved in these kind of activities are actually quite low in comparison to something, organised criminal who was dealing in narcotics, for example, tends to be quite a lesser sentence. So.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting, Lionel, the point that you made about people sharing posts of these images online is actually having an impact on the algorithms and having a much larger impact on the increasing scale of the crime, as opposed to people just, what they think is just harmlessly sharing a photo of an animal. Like I would never have thought that could play such a pivotal part in that. I find that astonishing. But now that you've said it, it makes perfect sense. But I absolutely just would not have thought of that as being an issue, and that's something that all of us could maybe learn from.
Yeah, and we have a direct responsibility, whether we want to accept it or not. Because sometimes when you hear on the news some ivory has been sold or like seized in Vietnam, you're like, oh, this is really far from my home. I just see cats, foxes, and magpies if I'm lucky. But actually, we have real impacts on how we behave on the internet, and social media is a good example. And so for us, our recommendation is to not share, but to report it. Most of the time, you can report it on any platforms. There is report button, which will also, and even though the adverts may not be removed directly, what's interesting is then it helps feed the moderation system of all of those platforms and their algorithms, so that will increase these moderation aspects. But then you also have the possibility to some NGO or law enforcement or whistleblower system to share the information with actors that can act on it. But in any case, when you report it, platforms are obliged to share it with law enforcement if they deem it worth it. So it can be frustrating, I know, that sometimes you report it, it's not out, or you can see a new account being recreated, etc. But in the long run, it is helpful, and it also helps tailor the algorithm, or at least not influence the algorithm of social media platforms to get you see all of those very cute animals that you're like, oh, that's a really fun videos of a parrot, but actually it helps. It basically fuels the demand for wildlife.
And I think that there's sort of this general consensus that if you share something on social media, you are, in your own mind, you're helping to raise awareness of the issue. And of course that sort of very much blends in with, actually, even though you are raising awareness because everyone who follows you can see that, but at the same time you're also contributing to the increase of the outreach of the criminals as well. So it's a very sort of double-edged sword, I guess, in that respect.
Yeah, I think it depends slightly on the kind of videos. I think that you're sort of sharing and things as well. I think the important thing to emphasize is when it's sort of, I think, shows kind of human interaction with wildlife in a sort of kind of pet sort of situation, I think, and liking that. I mean, there was a big case a number of years ago with a species called slow lorises. I don't know if either of you are familiar with it, but there were these videos going around of it was called the tickling slow lorises, because they sort of put their arms up in the air in this kind of, which looks like quite a sort of cute manner. But they are a very endangered species, and when they're actually putting their arms up in the air, it's actually a threat sort of situation. So it's they're not comfortable essentially. But these videos were doing the rounds; they were going viral, and then there was a huge spike in the pet trade for these slow lorises. So that just sort of illustrates what, sort of seemingly kind of funny videos is actually animal cruelty, but then also corresponding spike in pet trade, illegal trade.
And that's a good segue to a topical issue in the UK at the moment around animal cruelty online. And some of you hearing this podcast might have heard of that through mostly the BBC, around online monkey torture, of people sending money to, I will let you have a look if you want, but pay attention, is quite harsh to look at that. But that's also the thin line of between wildlife crime and animal cruelty online. But it's also very much linked to, it can increase the demands, but also just show the capacity that, or the ability we have as someone sitting behind a laptop here in the UK, in our case, and how much we can impact the other potential capuchin's monkeys in Indonesia. Just by sending money or liking, etc. And we also have had instances of also a spike in demand for products following influencers advertising or showcasing that they are, I'm with a cheetah, and everyone will follow them. So you also have the roles of influencers in that. And the example I have in mind is around Exotic Pet Cafe in Japan, and it's particularly Otter cafe that basically made it normal or acceptable as part of social norms to have an otter, which is definitely not a domesticated species, that basically increased by a lot the demand for otters from Southeast Asia, and some of the species are critically endangered. So that's also the link that just watching YouTube can have on the people on the ground and on the local population, animal population, but not just of other countries. There is some species in the UK that are being trafficked. We are talking about eels. That is actually the animals that is the most trafficked around the world.
Really?
In terms of numbers, yeah. And the UK we're also talking about bird of prey, or the peregrine falcons, for example.
Yeah, the eels is a really, really interesting one, and that's an interesting one in the sense that they were legally traded. They were sort of regulated in terms of the numbers and things that could be traded, but those kind of regulations didn't kick in fast enough, and then it sort of required that there's now a complete sort of international ban on the trade of European eels. So Anguilla is the species name. But because of that ban now, and there's still a huge demand in the destination countries, there is now a big sort of black market in these eels. Wow. So they're a food source in Asia. So they're the little baby elbers are used in sort of soups and very sort of high value cuisine. But yeah, and as a result, they're sort of now being trafficked, so captured illegally in Europe. There's actually been some big crime task force that's been set up to target the organised crime groups, but it's quite easy, to take these eels when they're small. They're sometimes mixed in with other sort of seafood products and sent internationally through legitimate sort of seafood companies. Also get cases of people literally just filling up suitcases and trying to get them through airports, big suitcases full of these eels as well. So Lionel also mentioned cheetahs there as well, which I think is a really good illustration of some of the sort of complexities that we're dealing with. So, I mean, cheetahs actually come under one of the highest levels of protection in terms of the regulation, because they are endangered in the wild. But due to sort of legal loopholes, they can still be traded, and there's a big demand for them in the Middle East. Lionel mentioned about influencers, so having them as pets in certain countries is the real sort of drive for the demand. But these legal loopholes sort of allow cheetahs to be traded through certain captive breeding facilities for educational purposes. And these educational purposes, I mean, it's sort of, there are no sort of appropriate checks at the demand side for what that kind of entails. So this sort of legal kind of trade still happens, but there's been a lot of investigations, not by myself, but I've seen that these cheetahs are actually being taken from the wild. They're being given microchips. The licensing is being forged, and then they're being traded through these loopholes. So it's really putting the already endangered species further endangered.
So, conscious of time, so the last question I'm going to ask you both is, what does the future of wildlife crime look like?
Good question.
Thank you very much. You weren't expecting that one.
Yeah, I think that's also a good opportunity to praise the work of law enforcers that never really get the praises, except on a few rare cases of rangers on the ground that are most of the case under-resourced, that are the one living a dangerous life to protect our planet. They're the real heroes, not the one that end up on newspapers. And also, I think corruption is one of the big problems that needs to be sorted. And we're also talking about high level of corruptions of people in many regions of the world are very high on the political ladder, to put it like that. Right. Which also makes it harder to. We're not just talking about normal citizens that are trafficking a species. You're also looking at high position person. So it comes back to having a systemic approach and tackling the demand to change the consumption behavior into a more sustainable behavior. So looking into alternatives and having really detailed and tailor what we call behavior change campaign is one of the key to tackle wildlife crime. The day we won't have any more demand, there won't be any more supply.
Yeah. By
cutting the demand, we will cut wildlife crime. And then there will be definitely an increase in the importance of the internet. There are a number of legislation that are being passed or implemented at the moment that I'm hoping will change the game. So in the EU, you have the EU Digital Services Act that is basically making everything that is illegal offline illegal online, including with sanctions that are high enough to be a good deterrent to the private sector and others. In the UK, there is the UK Online Safety Bill that doesn't include yet wildlife crime, but we're working hard to include wildlife crime on it. But that's where we need to have adequate legislation to tackle this constantly evolving organized crime, support law enforcement, tackle the demands, and work together and keep the fight is still going.
Amazing.
I think Lionel summed it up really well there, so just echo a few of his points really. But I think, he started off with, there is a lot of good work happening out there. There's a lot of very passionate individuals who are trying to, working in this space. I think from my perspective, some of the sort of fundamental things are really just about sort of increasing the awareness of wildlife crime in general, like some of the, non-compliance, rather than sort of overt kind of criminality, the non-compliance with the regulations and things around it could be avoided if there was more increased awareness of this. But that awareness increase would also help amongst sort of law enforcement as well, because at the moment it tends to fall to like the few who are sort of tasked or are the wildlife sort of crime investigators. But if there was more awareness across the board, because obviously it interacts with all the other crime types as well, that law enforcement would be able to sort of better spot where there are instances of wildlife crime. The last thing, I think, just increasing kind of recognition of the seriousness of the crime as well, I think is a really big one. Just getting that, it's serious in terms of the species, the threat it puts on the species, and there's impacts for local communities and local livelihoods, the environment in general. So yeah, I think just increasing recognition around that is really important as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for dedicating a podcast to that. That is much appreciated and support the work. And the last thing, and then I stop talking, is to stay hopeful. I think that's one of the components we need to have in this world, because every day we have bad news, but just to stay hopeful. We know the work is being done. There is lots of progress. We still have a long way to go, but we're on the right direction.
Yeah.
And tackling wildlife crime will help tackle all type of organized crime and protect better the biodiversity, our planet, in a time that is very much in need of that when we think of the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so that is all we have time for on this episode. I'd like to thank Lionel and Lauren for joining me today to talk about wildlife crime, and thank you very much, both of you. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.